We have two industry figures from both academia and business, Dr. Usama Fayyad and Marvin Scaff. I'll let them introduce themselves. And we have some good topics that we would be discussing with them. So, Marvin, would you please?
Thank you. So my name is Marvin Scaff. I'm the Chief Technology Officer for a company called Mach 49. And we partner with Global 1000 to help them launch startups primarily, and also have a part of our business that helps startups get funding through corporate venture capital funds. So we help corporates create new ventures and also invest in them through CVCs.
Thank you, Marvin.
Usama Fayyad. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Experiential AI at Northeastern University. We are a global university, so we have people here in Silicon Valley, Oakland, in Canada, and of course in Boston, which is our biggest campus, London, etc. I'm also chairman of Open Insights, which is my own company that started right after I left Yahoo. Works with, say, Fortune 1000 companies on AI, big data, and building solutions. So a lot of emphasis on data because every AI project translates to a data project very quickly.
Great, thank you. And Mona, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Hi.
Great.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Please.
Great. I'm sorry for not being there in person, but I'm actually on the East Coast. I couldn't make it out to San Francisco for today. My name is Mona Diab, and I'm the LTI Data Technology Institute Director at the Carnegie Mellon University, also a professor. And I just joined recently back in academia. Before that, I was at Meta. I was the lead research scientist for responsible AI. And prior to that, I was at Amazon. And then before that, I was at George Washington University as a professor. I work on natural language processing and responsible AI. Yeah, that's it.
We have a lot of brain power on AI here on the stage and remote. We'll make sure we make the best out of the 45 minutes to come, and we'll open it for questions and answers. So a lot of things to talk about, I think, and we looked at a lot of great presentations, a lot of great discussions. Now, one of the things that really come to mind is how ready are we for AI, and what are we doing to bridge the gap so we're more prepared and ready for the wave to come?
I think that it's still really early. Like, we're all a bunch of geeks and technologists, but as far as like mainstream business adoption, I think it's very early innings. I think a lot of activity and AI development that was spawned because of the popularity of ChatGPT. Corporations are hearing about it. Executives are wanting to find use cases and problems to solve with it. But I still think it's such an early time in this development.
Usama.
So I can look at it intellectually, academically, and I can look at it economically. Scientifically, academically, things like large language models of today, if you're talking just about learning a whole bunch of 100 billion to a trillion or more weights, it's not scientifically interesting at all. I mean, there's two scientific questions there, and we can talk about them at the break. One is, why do these large language models work anyway when statistics says they shouldn't? And the other has to do with what happens when you transform something into that space, the embedding space. Nobody quite understands why those things work. But other than that, the technology is not interesting. Economically, it is super interesting. Why? Because we have, over the past 30, 40 years, 50 years, created a knowledge economy where most of the work is repetitive, robotic, and can stand a heck of a lot of acceleration. So the difference here between when 40 years ago we had breakthroughs in chess players and machines started playing chess better than humans, that didn't have much of an economic impact. But when something promises to accelerate tasks in the knowledge economy, and today knowledge economy is, according to the UN, between 19% and 35% globally. For advanced economies like the US, it's actually between 31% and 55%. Even if you accelerate it by 5%, you cannot ignore that, even 1%. I actually think the technology in the typical knowledge economy of today can cause acceleration of probably 15 to 80%, depending on the task. That is definitely not something we will ignore, and that is why the technology will be with us for a while economically, whether we're ready for it or not. And there's many issues about human readiness, ability to understand what these things do, where do they fail, how do I use them correctly. All of that is not worked out at all. But I think companies and organizations cannot ignore the acceleration. And I say acceleration, not replacement. The stuff is not ready to replace humans. But if you have humans check the output and be responsible for it, there's a lot of acceleration to be had.
Great. Thank you, Usama. Muna, what about in academia? How is academia looking at AI and our readiness and future generations and serving the upcoming tech wave that's going to be needed in AI?
Yeah, it's creating a huge challenge for us from several angles. Basically, a lot of the programs are now sort of like pivoting and trying to even repivot and reframe a lot of our educational systems, a lot of our talent building to address this new sort of like disruption in technology, disruption in AI. I just wanted to highlight. I even though I agree with Usama around maybe it's not necessarily that interesting from zeros and ones perspective, the technology that were built around LLMs. But there is a lot of enigma, and a lot of sort of like black magic that we still don't understand exactly why is it so powerful, why is it working so well. And this is actually a very interesting problem space. So scientifically, that's an interesting endeavor for us to pursue. And a lot of the work that we're doing is actually trying to figure out, why is this working so well, actually? In principle, it's a very simple, simplistic methodology, simplistic approach towards dealing with language, or you think about it in vision and what have you. So that in itself is a nice research angle for people in academia to pursue a little bit more than what you get to see in industry, for example, asking the why question. But there's also the talent gap, which is a really big problem that we see from like my experience in the 6 years I was in industry. We don't have people who are very versed into the forays of exactly what's going on. They can build the technology, but they don't understand, for example, or we don't understand exactly how it works, as I mentioned. So understanding that, but also the talent gap around how to handle technology at that scale. So that's also another aspect that I think is really, really important. A lot of people learn sort of by osmosis or by sort of apprenticeship, but we don't have disciplines that are actually addressing these challenges in a principled way. So I feel like academia has a role to play in this narrative, so to speak. But again, like everybody's scrambling to actually address how to address actually this disruptive technology. So for example, a lot of us are talking about. I just had a meeting today, for example, with the machine learning department, and we were just discussing like how can we attract talent to come and actually study these sciences, because everybody wants to go out to industry and work on these latest technologies without necessarily having the chops to do this the right way. And when I say the right way, who prescribes the right way, right? So a lot of these questions are being pondered right now.
Great. So as we put efforts, investments to get more ready for AI, another important topic which comes to mind, which is regulations and making sure that we're pursuing responsible AI. And let me start with you, Mona, in terms of academia, universities, and their role in developing the regulatory framework for AI. Is there anything happening in the academia front that you could share with us?
So we're seeing across the major institutions in the country, a lot of these institutes are sort of like burning out, coming out. Like the Institute for AI, Responsible AI, HI at Stanford, at CMU, we have the Block Institute, which actually has a Block Center, which has the Responsible AI initiative. So I think in every institution now, or every major institution, there is something that tries to address this, the juxtaposition of artificial intelligence with policies. And they're trying to figure out a way to, frame the narrative or help frame the narrative, because obviously industry is a big player in this game. Typically, the traditional role has always been innovation happens in academia, in the academy, and then industry sort of picks up. But in this situation, it's kind of flip-sided, right? It flipped a flipped role, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Where we ended up having industry sort of leading the way, especially around this disruptive technology, because academia, frankly, doesn't have the resources to build these models at that scale. So basically, the academy is trying to actually figure out a space to sort of like come in and figure out, okay, now we're going to tell you how this should be done the right way. And basically, they also can afford to have input from different disciplines simultaneously, which is different from what you get to see in technology, the technology sector. So, for example, we have people who work in different aspects of ethics, different aspects of accountability, governance, and so on, who come from the legal domain, who come from the, like the social sciences domains, come from the policy domains, from the media domains, and so on. So we can afford to have that level of intellectual, simmering, so to speak, and hopefully we can affect policy and regulation in tandem and obviously in collaboration with industry. I mean, we're very clearly behind when it comes to the actual ownership of these models with this disruptive technology, if you think about it this way.
So clearly, a lot of domains involved in setting the regulations and making sure they serve AI and its purpose. Well, which leads to another question, Usama. So, is developing AI regulations, is that going to be an accelerator for adopting AI, or is it going to be a roadblock?
Yeah. So very quickly, fully agree with what Mona said. I will also add another twist to this. You talk to companies, everybody wants to do responsible AI. You look at what they do, and most of them famously laid off their ethics team, their responsible AI teams, etc. So they're not taking it seriously, and that's why I think academia can play a huge role here in defining it. Now we still have to figure out what it is. At Northeastern, for example, we chose the path to figure out what it is and what to teach, is to say, let's practice it. Let's actually work with companies on the issues, tackle the issues. How do you detect risk? How do you address risk? How do you do algorithmic audits systematically and lightly and so forth? Now, regulation, and that's through that experience, we hope to evolve a learning curriculum, because I don't think right now any company or any university really understands what responsible AI is. It's a very rich area academically, and we should figure it out. The regulation, though, is very interesting because, in dealing with regulators, one of the things we learned very quickly is most regulators are in dire need of education. They need to even understand what is this, right? And how do we think about it? My view in general in regulation is if you put the right pillars in place. So for me, I would start by saying, figure out liability first. Meaning, there is no algorithm that should be liable for anything. It is always a human or a legal entity. These are the entities that can be liable. So even if your algorithm is dealing with people, somebody has to hold the responsibility, be it the company or. When you put that introduces self-regulation before even the regulators understand, because people are worried about liability. Then it becomes a healthy environment for regulation to come in and allow these companies who are now afraid because of liability reasons to operate within certain guidelines and say, hey, if you're within these guidelines, with these guardrails, you're okay. So you're less likely to be sued and you can use the regulation to defend you. I always use the analogy that regulation is done properly. Sports cars have very expensive brakes, not because we want them to go slower, but because we want them to go faster. So if you actually build these things in the right framework, you can do a lot. But the road is still very murky. Actually, I believe the first real national regulation will probably come out from China. EU will probably follow, and the US will be third. But all these regulators suffer from not understanding what the heck they're trying to regulate. And we need to fix that quickly.
Great. Marvin.
Just one thing to build on that. I was working with one of our clients in the UK. It's an aerospace company. They've been using AI, responsible AI, for quite some time. And during COVID, they did some collaborations, and there was concerns about access to data. And they published an open source framework called the Lithia framework. And it's something that if you're not familiar with it, you might want to take a look at just for inspiration for some of the topics that were mentioned here. And it's been, I think, adopted, more probably in the EU, but it's something that I think is, they were early adopters. They recognized and put forth like a position paper, a manifesto around it. It's something to check out online.
Great. So now on corporate and from that perspective, let me ask another question. So as we launched Bel Esprit today, and we have a lot of kind of ambitions and plans, and we're making things happen in terms of adoption of AI, making it easy, accessible for everybody, right? So they can leverage the power of AI. Ultimately, in organizations and companies, we want this to produce business outcomes quickly and add value to executives, to leaders across the board and lines of business. So how do you see AI playing a role in driving business value and creating business outcomes faster?
I think it's really difficult to keep up with all the technologies, all the different language models. I think having tools like Bel Esprit available to augment the humans to be able to create solutions faster using natural language will be very much a game changer for it. I think right now, the talent gap in finding engineers that understand the technologies, know how to work with it, is a big challenge. And when you think about like building teams and like what before having like ChatGPT or GitHub Copilot, tools like that, it takes you longer to do things as an engineer. Where if you can take your talent and augment your skills with the language models and code interpreters, then you get, for a startup, you get a longer runway or more capital efficient. And I think those are the things that I would look at as like being advantages by building tools like this and just kind of keep evolving the tool chain versus building more complex.
Great. Usama, what are your thoughts on AI, business value, business outcomes, and solving real problems that we're struggling to solve on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, I mean, if I can say anything, it's a very confusing time. The large language models seem to work for language reasonably well, but they have serious problems. What Amr referred to as hallucination, I usually prefer to call errors. But because hallucination implies the model has an understanding of what the heck it's saying. They are stochastic parrots, to quote the real scientific description. Parrots in the sense that they don't understand what they say, stochastic in the sense that they have randomness. Now, so what does this all mean? You have a lot of confusing messages. You have the hyperscalers, some of them are in the room, AWS, etc., who are motivated for all the right economic reasons to say big models are good, right? Use our models, use our utility. But those things are, computation hogs, right? Extremely expensive to train, very expensive to use, not as expensive to train, obviously, but there's issues. How do you keep them current? How do you keep them up to date? And I think that the demo by Amr was a great example of this. What I love about what's happening with, and in that environment, people will get frozen. Some people will start getting dependent on the large utility models without even asking questions. Hey, are smaller models better? I have many, many instances where smaller is actually much better. People are beginning to publish papers saying GPT-4 is actually worse than GPT-5. And I'm not surprised. OpenAI is no longer open. We actually don't know how many parameters are in 3.5 versus 4.0. We think it's 500 billion in 3.5, 1.3 trillion hypothesis in 4.0. The last we knew was GPT-3, which was 175 billion. I am seeing like Llama 2 models with 13 billion parameters, 10 billion parameters, do amazing things. And they do them much more stably, exponentially less expensively. But again, nobody really understands. Do I really need this big model? The hyperscalers will say yes. Many people will say, no, not really. You don't need the full language. You don't need multiple languages. You need these narrow models, which are easier to build, train, etc. Now, in all of this, what I like about what's being done with Bell Esprit, honestly, is the fact that it's an attempt to democratize this. And it's two components that are unique, right? One is the fact that it sits on top of a marketplace where anybody can bring stuff out. Like I was asking Amr, what the hell are you doing with these guys? He said, well, we're on the marketplace. And, our friend from Amazon was asking, why isn't Amazon, showing up as some of the options? That is a very healthy dynamic. I think giving people the choice, the easy choice to pick is beautiful. The second part is, it is very confusing. I don't know whether today's solution, the expertise that says put the solution together and make it work, I don't know if that's the final answer. But it's a good answer. It's a start. It will enable so many people to try out stuff, which will actually challenge the vendors to come up with truly innovative stuff if they're going to challenge what they can do with Bell Esprit. But I actually think it's a great platform.
Great, thank you, Usama. Muna, your thoughts?
So I completely agree with what was before by both Marvin and Usama. And in fact, I feel like we're at a very interesting inflection point for our technologies in general, where lay people are starting to get curious about these technologies. And lay people meaning, well, obviously the business angle of this and the entrepreneurship angle of this, but there's also the young minds. So I think K through 12 and like undergraduate students. So they're getting more and more interested by they want to be part of this technology somehow, somewhere, in some shape or form. And I feel that in itself is a huge accomplishment. So getting the young minds, creativity into this narrative, into this whole discussion and potentially participation is, I feel like, a really big I thank you to OpenAI for making ChatGPT available, ChatGPT actually before even ChatGPT. So from that perspective, I feel like it went a long way towards democratizing, garnering people's imagination, so to speak. So I feel like this in itself is a huge feat. So it's actually a positive, it's a virtue, not a bug. I mean, with all the reservations associated with technology, obviously, our random hallucinations, errors, uncontrollability, scale, and what have you. So,
Great. Thank you. Now, I'll open it to the audience to ask questions if you have any. If you don't, we have a few more, but let's see what you have. Let me give you the mic.
Hi, my question is, what are the top 3 challenges you see in terms of the responsible AI? And even though these exist, why are companies not investing money and time on it? Like you said, that many are actually laying off these departments. So where is the disconnect?
Maybe Muna can start. He's the expert.
So it's interesting because, okay, so the perception is that responsible AI, if you want to take it in its holistic view, around accountability, traceability, explainability, fairness, diversity and inclusion. There's so many aspects associated with responsible AI, but you think about all the dimensions. They are, from the perspective of a time to market, they could be a hindrance, or at least perceived as a hindrance, because it's just like, especially in the paradigm that we have today, where it's always an afterthought. So in a sense, people design things, they build products, and they want to put them out to the market. And if you had not anticipated all these aspects when you're designing, devising, and deploying, well, developing and deploying, it becomes a friction point. So what people like myself were trying to do when we were inside these different organizations was call out for, we need to think about this proactively from the get-go. How you source your data, how you build your models, what actual optimization functions are you using? Are they, biased in some way or the other? And there are people who work on algorithmic bias that could have been, consulted, but given again the time to market, the lack of training, the lack of talent associated with some of these, buildings, it ends up being, a friction point. And unfortunately, it's very hard to fix later on. So that addresses a little bit of the responsible AI. The second part of your question was, why are people getting laid off from these departments? Was that the second part of the question?
Why are companies not focusing on them? There is huge implication.
Why are the big AI companies not keeping these ethics departments and focusing on this area?
I actually don't know. I mean, I wasn't laid off, to be honest, but I mean, in general, it's framed in the context of we don't need that many people working in this area. Not that they lay off everybody, but they actually trim them down, assuming that you need less of these talents. And in a way, I feel like there's also an aspect of people working on responsible AI.
Internet.
All right, I think we lost your internet, so yeah. Unstable.
It's Apple.
I think we're having an issue with internet. I actually, in many cases, companies end up laying them off because what they advocate may not align with where the company wants to go or may put the company in trouble. I actually believe, and therefore their reaction is to say, enough of this, I don't want it said in my name. Then, of course, the people working in this area have high standard of ethics, and they will say, I will not be silenced, and that leads to human drama. So, going back to why it's important, because I think the danger of running away with the technology and putting out solutions that start creating harm, none of these systems mean to create harm, but the applications actually could easily create situations where we create harm. And all you need to do is have a few incidents like this, and it will set the field back a long way. It will give it a bad name and so forth. So to me, having a focus on responsible AI is important to at least keep the innovation happening in a safer environment. And I agree fully with what Muna said. This is the biggest problem, is not thinking about responsible AI in all stages of development. It should become part of, from conception of the idea to designing it, to doing the development, to doing the research, to doing the customer support. If you think of these things through, you'll minimize the risk of having these bad incidents. And we are heading to a space where bad incidents are going. We just don't want it to kill the field.
First, thank you, panelists. What a great panel. I thought Usama's comment connecting responsible AI to liability is probably the smartest thing I heard all week. And that is the root cause for why people, I'm guessing it's the root cause why people don't even keep these departments around, because they're not paying, there's no risk that they have to manage. And I think if you solve that problem, obviously, the economic forces would help quite a bit. So I think that is, I want to just underline that because that was fantastic. I am curious, however, what are the harms? Where would you start in terms of harms that we should be, where a liability might be assigned, and who should pay? Would be the smart thing there.
Well, in my world, and I'm not a lawyer, as long as you assign the liability to a suable entity, whether it's a legal entity or a human, that kind of takes care of it.
Yeah.
The dangerous thing is when you say it's the algorithm, go figure it out. Google might change the Google search, and suddenly a whole 20% of businesses in a certain space might die because of this little change, and they'll say it's not my problem, it's the algorithm, it's machine learning. Well, BS, right? There's somebody needs to say you're responsible for it. The algorithm is just a tool, and you're driving the tool. And I think this wrong perception that these machines are somehow thinking and conscious of what they're doing, and therefore they're responsible, is the root of the problem here. People should challenge that, and this is where responsible AI comes in, because at the end of the day, it's a function of what data you fed it, how you chose to train it, what kind of biases you chose to admit to having or not having, or denying them. Those are all boiled down to the teams, engineers, VPs, CEOs of the companies who actually created this stuff.
And which harms?
Harms?
Which harms?
Which harms? I mean, I think the market will determine the harms, right? If somebody stands up and say, I am harmed in this way, we can't think of all of them in advance, but it's basically up to people to make the arguments, and then up to the judicial system to adjudicate and say, yeah, this is a real harm or this is a false claim. Yeah. I don't think anybody knows which harms to start with.
Yeah, because that is one, but it goes down from there.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Just maybe build on that.
Sure.
Money and governance, and if it's boards that have advocate D&O insurance or cyber policy. I think with regulation of AI, there's going to be back to who's harmed by it, what's the financial. But it's still early. But there's governments regulating countries, or insurance companies are going to have new products that don't have some type of financial outcome. Yeah, go ahead, Mona. Sorry, go ahead.
So,
You wanted to
No, can you hear me? Oh, okay, great. Now, so I just wanted to highlight this whole notion of responsible thinking. And that's part of the reason I believe academia has a role to play here, is in fact training the talent, thinking in a responsible way, in the way from, as I mentioned, from ideation all the way up to deployment. Now, with the question of regulation, I think we need to be inspired by other technologies, like critical system technologies. Think about like the airplane or the aerospace technology, medical devices, autonomous driving cars. They have a lot more going on for them in terms of regulations. I just had a meeting with going. And they were talking about how they're
that's networking. You can start over this. And let's not do too many additions. That's
we need to also identify when technology results in catastrophic failures. That's really important. So maybe, as AI practitioners, we should not just rely on our own, expertise. We should be reaching out to people from software engineering, people from validation and verification kind of areas, in terms of especially around these large systems, where there is a lot of expertise in those other domains that could actually lend some, wisdom to what we tend to do. So I feel like that could also be part of how the regulation boils down at the end of the day.
Hey, panelists, thank you so much. Monish here. Just a quick question on if you have advice on what great looks like, or if there's a framework for what great responsible AI looks like. There's a lot of builders here. I'm a builder myself, building a company around this. And, what are some things that we should keep in mind? What is a great framework? And is there an example of someone who's doing this really well?
I think the one that I mentioned earlier was with depth for inspiration. It's called the Alethea framework from the R squared labs. ALETHIA. You Google R squared or R2 data labs, the Alethea framework. That's something that I think GDPR came out of the EU. Inspirationally, as builders, that's something to take a look at. I would expect that similar things are going to be adopted.
Mona? Yeah.
Yeah. To me, it seems like I mean, a good example in my book has always been Anthropic's work. I have a little bit of a bias to what they do. But in general, I feel like, not I feel like, I mean, I've tried to be as transparent as possible, as open as possible in the research we do. Like making sure that when we're sourcing data, when we're querying data, we actually know what we're dumping into the models. When we're looking at algorithms, we try to assess what levels of bias are in there. So you have like really good traceability of what you're building and how you're building it, and when you're deploying it and where you're deploying it. So being very accountable helps a lot. And for example, sorry, my voice is going away. When we deployed OPT, I should drink your water, right? When we deployed OPT 175 back in 2021, we made it a point to make sure that every aspect of the model was as open as possible, as traceable. We actually even published our logbook of how, in fact, these systems were built with a lot of systems engineering. It's not just the AI component, but actually the underlying engineering aspects of it. So, being as open as possible. So I really believe in the openness angle, but also in the transparency and the documentation. And a lot of this requires so much tooling. And that's something that I think is put swept under the rug when people talk about building technology. I feel like if we don't have the right kind of tooling, the right kind of infrastructure to help build these technologies using game. So, and I feel like it needs to be elevated to a first-class citizen in our enterprise in general. In fact, a lot of people talk about tooling as if it's like, something mediocre or something, it's something beneath the engineering. And I believe this is actually the perception. So I feel like that needs to be elevated in our, discussion.
I'll give a view from a different point of view. I think this is well covered, but I get asked this question a lot. What's a great example of using generative AI today commercially? And really these days, I'm a big fan of Adobe Firefly. Why? Because the first thing they did is that we're going to build our own model. But number two is they use data that they fully own, right? They've been building image libraries for the past 30, 40 years. As a result, they indemnify the user completely against any IP rights. So if you sue some user, it's Adobe's problem, not the user's problem. And most importantly, it was an extreme, they really were very thoughtful about how do I embed this in Photoshop in an intuitive way, right? Okay, highlight a part of the image and say fill with this, right? Or type in something and say, put a cat in here that's eating a sandwich. And it's a beautiful integration in a platform that's used by tens of millions of people around the world. So that's a beautiful example. I think Microsoft stands a very good chance to do really good stuff with Outlook, PowerPoint, etc. Now the real question is, where do they get the kind of data that can allow them to indemnify the user? That's a challenge because people's emails are people's emails. What do you use to train, right? They acquired GitHub and they had access to all these programs. Do they really have rights to those programs? I don't know. I'll let the lawyers deal with it. But that's like a big question to me. So that's why I like Adobe a lot as an example of how they did it. And the other part is they did it fairly quickly, right? 3 to 4 months after these models came out, these guys were smart enough to jump and say, what is the right way to do it from a user perspective, and they did it right. And I don't work for Adobe, so I just
Thank you.
hats off to them.
Hi, panel. Hi, Mona. I've been following the AI regulation and safety for many years, but I struggle with the European Aviation Safety Program. They have a lot of good standards, EU Act. The problem, a lot of these deal with traditional machine learning, neural network. Are you aware of any kind of proposal for large language model that's very different beast than machine learning or other? Is there anything other that we're aware of? I think what I've seen is nobody's kind of even discussing those things that are outside human ability to comprehend.
We have a responsible AI framework at the Institute for Experiential AI, and we quickly kind of came up with one that's specifically built for large language models. We kind of say, here's the guidelines, here's the way you think about governance, here's the way you think about implementation, here's how you assess it. Some of the regulations coming out in some of the countries, partial, are actually dealing directly with the things that come out of this. But regulators don't really try to regulate, are you using a decision forest or a large language model? They basically talk about the usage and where it happens. Now, I think Mona is much more of an expert. You may have some.
So actually, I didn't hear the question quite well. Are we talking about alternative technologies, like alternative architectures? Is that the question?
No. The question is, he's been following the regulation for quite a while, and he hasn't seen anything that is specifically targeting large language models as opposed to just general AI and things like that. Yeah. So that's the question.
Oh, so actually at Meta, we had playbooks around how to in fact employ responsible AI tenets around generative AI in general and around large language models. They were not published outside of Meta, but they were published internally. So there are manifestos around this, and I believe Google has some, Microsoft has some, Partnership on AI also has some. They talk about general AI in general, but internally, for example, as I said, within Meta, we actually had playbooks of how to operationalize a lot of these tenets, specifically arguing and working with large language models. And we did this for multiple types of architectures. So we did this for the mixture of experts, MOE, types of architectures. We did this for the causal models, things that are like GPT-4, and GPT-2 to be, and so on. That's within the industry, my experience in industry. Within academia, I haven't seen much come out, to be honest, around specific. Maybe Stanford has something in high, like Percy Lang's group, but the majority of these things I've seen have happened only, at least my experience has been within industry. And I just wanted to highlight one thing. I think this was mentioned earlier by, either Usama or Marvin, which is around, the sequence of power regulations seems to come down the pipe. And what I've noticed is always happens abroad. So we start off with, especially the European Union has a lot more regulations, a lot more thought, a proactive thinking around this topics. And then the US sort of inherits a lot of that. So we should keep an eye on what's going on in Europe, bottom line.
So I apologize if I come across as a little bit cynical. That's my caveat, okay? When I keep hearing the responsible AI regulation, I guess I keep thinking of you've got your vegetables and then you've got your organic vegetables, right? And organic vegetables, you get an extra couple dollars of premium because it says the word organic. So everybody loves to hear the word responsible in front of AI, but the meaning is a little bit hollow again without the regulation. What does that regulation look like, in reality? Because you already said, the politicians don't even, they need a lot of education, and I liken that to financial regulations where the Michael Milkens they're just smarter than the people making the regulations, and by the time the regulations come out, which is a very slow process, there'll be 15 ways to get around them before the ink's dry. So, and when you talk about liability, is it the gun or is it the person holding the gun that's liable? Because that's also something that's been debated ad nauseum, and they haven't really come to a resolution about that. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about what does regulation actually mean, or what could it possibly look like going forward?
So I can address this a little bit. So I think about this again because it depends on how you conceive of or how you actually think of the technologies and their impact on society. So if you think they're going to be, a fringe kind of thing, then yeah, maybe you're right. It's organic versus non-organic. It's maybe a little bit of extra spice, so to speak. But actually, in reality, we are starting to see how this technology is affecting everybody in every possible way, whether directly or indirectly. So I think of this more like it should be something like the FDA when it comes to regulating medicine and medication. So there's sort of, I know the process is slow, and this is another aspect that maybe the politicians and the policymakers need to be educated on how to be expeditious and maybe learn from previous experiences. Of course, everything has to be contextualized, and I understand that these things are not necessarily simple, but maybe they need to be, using AI to expedite their processes and how to make decisions around policy. But in general, I don't see it as something like I don't see that there's a slight variation. I see there's a huge variation, especially when technology makes catastrophic errors. So if the catastrophic errors are not, controllable, then we're in trouble. And that opens the door to maybe checking out other architectures, other types of technologies that give us the same effect. So generative AI is not only about large language models. So before large language models, we had other technologies. And we're in fact right now investing in other tech architectures that are more controllable. So you hear a lot of people within, the jargon field talking about controllability. It actually means that from the get-go, you build in levers and you build in guardrails that could actually control the technology so it doesn't result in these catastrophic errors from the beginning. You don't receive it to chance. So that together with
No food left
regulation
for
from the
me.
other side, you end up getting a balancing act.
Oh, shoot. I mean,
Yeah, I was just thinking about, as we're asking the question, the SEC
I'll
came
go get
out
my
with
Pokeball there.
regulations for communication.
God,
And there was a
Are you
famous
there?
stand-up comedian that got arrested, George Carlin, he did a bit about the 7 words.
Mhm.
So I think, government entities, that will be politicized, but I think the regulatory bodies will come out with frameworks that will get tested and challenged. But in 2-3 years from now, we'll probably have a plan on some lives that will decide.
Not much to add. I mean, I think it'll probably start with checklists. These are things that we know are bad, and here they are defined. If you commit them, it's a problem. And here are things that we think are safe. And if you do these, we think you're okay. That's how it will start. It will evolve over time, but it's got to start somewhere.
Next, Fiata, then I'll be given.
And also, I just wanted to add one little thing. The fact that China is a huge competitor in this space is also a driving force for them to actually get their act together, I think. So economically, it does, if you want to stay relevant, you have to be really, really, expeditious.
I have a quick question. Thank you, Sandra. So, question is, I think I'm at left, but how does regulation or AI regulation fit into RAG? Is it like already related by using the RAG technology, or is it something that we have to look into it more deeper?
What is the question? Sorry, can somebody repeat the question if you don't mind?
There was a demo earlier for retrieval augmented generation. So he was trying to understand the context of the impact of regulations when you're not just using the model, but when you're implementing like RAG as a technique to augment the prompt.
Using RAG as a technique?
Yeah, I think, is that?
Yes, yeah, that's the question. Thank you.
Okay. Want to take that one? Go ahead, Mona, if you have a thought on that.
I still don't get the question, to be honest. So, what is the regulation when we're using human augmentation?
Right. So when there was a demo earlier from the CEO for Vectara, and they provide like semantic search technologies or embedding similar to like the Face project or Pinecone would be a competitor. Mm-hmm. So being able to take into consideration what are the impacts when you're not just using the language model, but you're using these techniques to use retrieval augmented generation as an approach to get rid of the hallucination or the error problem. How are you handling that? And how does that impact like the regulatory frameworks?
So I'm kind of familiar with what Tara is doing. So the idea is if you augment the machine output with human sort of like fixes, so similar to what that's RLHF is trying to do, right? It's basically trying to have this overlay. And is that going to affect regulation in a negative or positive way? Is that the question?
Or will regulation have an impact on RAG?
The other way around, if regulation will have impact on RA. Yeah.
Just as regulation would help you manage your AI system, the base system, you just extend the boundary of that to include the RAG component. You understand the whole system is then it includes RAG. So you're
already compliant with RAG, you are already making it compliant. So why is RAG not a solution for regulation?
No.
Why can't we think of that?
It might mitigate some issues.
RAG is just augmentation, so it's just addition to the existing system. Whatever regulations apply to the base system apply to the RAG component as well. So you just extend the boundary. Make sense? It's just an augmentation.
So basically, RAG and RLHF have been added to these systems as a way of creating increased human value alignment, right? That's the principle, and that's in principle the idea behind that, right? So whether you try to do like more knowledge grounding in some reputable knowledge bases and what have you, so you're doing some kind of grounding. With RLHF, you're trying to do something that also gives you more grounding, but in the human space. But the point here is, does that affect regulation? It's supposed to make your systems less hallucinatory, less error prone, right? It makes it more value aligned, but that doesn't preclude you from actually having regulation that still makes sure that the system is actually safe and it's actually not creating, havoc or creating bad output. Whatever the definition of bad is in the right context.
Great.
So you cannot say, if we get this kind of technology, we don't need regulation anymore. That's the point that I'm trying to make.
Thank you, Mana. So we have room for one last question. Yes.
Thanks to the panelists. Marhaba Usama, I'm a big fan and I follow you online, and this is more of a personal question for you. I know that you met AI leaders in the industry like Jan LeCun and Andrew, and how do you measure their sentiment towards regulation? Because most of us here work for these big tech companies, and we know that the buck stops at their desk, right? So really just wanted to get your sense about their sentiment of your regulations. Thank you.
I mean, these are people I have a lot of respect for, so I can't speak to their opinion. From my interaction with some of these folks, I mean, Jan LeCun, for example, wants to see reasonable regulation in place because he's beginning to understand the potential dangers. You can take a more extreme example like Jeff Hinton, who has gone off the other extreme, saying, these things are out of control. All of these are like different cries for saying, somebody needs to get ahead of this and do something about it. So it's a spectrum. I mean, for some of them, I think Jan's approach is the most pragmatic and reasonable, where he's saying, well, this technology works well in some areas, it doesn't work well in some areas. So for the first time, he started talking about symbolic systems coming back in, right? There's others who are hardcore, no, we'll solve it with just weights. I just need more weights, which I think is too much. Personally, I think that's not the solution. I think the best solution is going to be, we've been working on some programs where we say it's better together. So Amr stuff is an example of it. But if I have a knowledge graph, or I have a citation graph, or I have a social graph, can I use that along with an LLM, hopefully a smaller LLM? I like the term smart language models as opposed to large language models, so we right size it. I think that those are better approximations towards better solutions. But how these people care about regulation, I think the leaders in the field are beginning to worry about the consequences And once they've achieved their notoriety, their big worry is, okay, let's put in mechanisms to make sure that what I have to create doesn't get us in trouble. So that's probably why they care.
Thank you, Usama. And timekeeping is always the biggest challenge, right? We're an hour over, but that's great. Actually, it's not it's great interactions. Was very interesting, extremely valuable. Thank you very much, our panel and Mona calling in remotely. That was extremely valuable for everyone. Thank you all for coming. And before we close, I wanna, where's Hassan? Oh, here you are. Yeah, you have your mic. Okay, Hassan.
I want to echo this. Thank you very much for the speakers. Thank you for all of you guys for the conversations. I love your last thing. I mean, I am behind hybrid systems for forever. Even when we started, I mean, I started building hybrid systems in 2004 for machine translation, machine learned and symbolic. I think there is value in it for sure. So thank you for bringing that up. And thank you, everyone. I mean, I want you to, I mean, the last minutes, we should actually make use of conversing with each other, getting to know each other. As we said earlier, people with this T-shirt, they are from Explain. I want you to talk to them. If we don't find enough time, I mean, reach out to us online. Or in real life IRL, right? So we can converse and learn from you and introduce you also to Bellesprit. So thank you very much for coming, and let's talk. Thank you.